Still have to put my shoes on. Uh-oh. What happened to the did I lose it last night in the commotion? Would it be lost forever, but somewhat necessary. The person I one of the people I should say now, I put the high heels on for. I don't even know if he really watches anymore. Doesn't really write me anymore. But the people that demand me to take my shoes off are so mean and rude and nasty. I almost wish there was like more than just banning. Like I wish there was a way to like duck hunting like on the screen. Like Terry could just like at them and their name explodes into fireworks and then they're gone like smithereens forever. But where's that all these trolls? Is it no? That's the same original one. I put on these gray ones. There, how about I put these on? These are pretty. A little more lacing to do, but okay. Because of how I still because I cut my foot, so I still I had to like cover it. Depressing day. I mean, since that happened last night, was shaking. I couldn't talk, very twitchy. I took Benadryl, fell asleep. Um, I tried to stay up longer, and then I ended up getting up early this morning, like 6 something my time. Sorry to try to get this lace right. And I ended up taking a nap around 10 to like after 12. What's good? Um, I don't know. When non-members fuck off. I don't know. I don't know what to tell you. Everyone on my OF knows it was a horrible weekend. They know what happened. They know what's been happening. So read the room. Where's my I had to nap yourself. Well, that's good. Is that the wrong? This one guy I finally blocked. He kept writing me like, "I want your honest opinion about my little dick." That was like the weirdest thing. And it wasn't that made me blocked him. It was like, you're not even following me. And like, it's like, I don't know. People catch me on the wrong day. Like, I don't know what to tell you. If you don't see what I'm doing, I'm lacing this one. Oh, so where we left off our protagonist in the west, he went out west. So I was thinking of like Western names. He's about to get his ass kicked. I mean, he's a persona non grata, so to speak, sort of. Uh, Latin. So um, I was like, well, it's not the best Western because he's probably about to die. So I was like, how about bestdern Western, but like with a D because it's Dern. Yeah, that's the ticket. It was either that or How the West Was Won. Or figured they wouldn't like that as a title. So, bestdern western. There's one. Watch all this tying, and some asshole's still gonna come on and be like, "Take your shoes off." I guess someone was on the other night and thought that they could write, "Take all that shit off," and not get banned. And that to me was like, wow, are they serving stupid cakes now at the McDonald's or something? Because you got yourself a full serving there. I'm thinking, how was your day? Love those shoes. Thank you. All right. Okay. Extremely R worded. Almost done. How we doing on time? Good. We're gonna get a lot of reading in tonight. Here we go. See? Strap up. Saddle up. I just don't want to get to the part where he dies. I don't know how he dies or what. If we even find out. But how cute. All right, let's get. I got my coffee. Oh, and I started my most lovely time of the month. It feels like the week, like every other week or something. But anyway, so I have that too. I've had cramps today. Oh, you guys saw. I tried to lay outside for a little while for my depression, and I think it helped slightly. And I did jump in the pool and out, so that's why my hair's wet. I did not take a shower yet. I mean, I took one last night after the show, but um, not since then. Brought out a piece of furniture, some more bags so far, like 5. So it's been a non-zero day. I mean, I've been getting some stuff done, just more sadly. So come and perk me up. Oh, so can't see myself yet. So, am I okay? There I am. All right. Oh, I do look like a little sun. I think a little. I mean, I could be wrong. Could be a wishful thinking, but I feel like a little pinkness. Chapter 21. The remains of a life. From atop the treeless bluffs overlooking the big river, they could see them coming, high-decked, clangorous ships churning upstream to dock at the world's innermost port. At the end of the marine highway to the west, at Fort Benton, the steam wheelers spit out people, bearded and armed, their skin the color of the cliffs above the Missouri River. The prospectors hired wagons to take them further into buffalo country or brought ponies to gallop south to the gold fields. They scraped and clawed at land scraped by water and then moved on to scrape and claw again. They were in such a hurry. The Blackfeet, so named because of the dark markings at the bottom of their moccasins, called themselves Nitsitapi, the original people. Their words had skipped along this river, and their chants had disappeared into night skies long before anyone introduced a god on a cross or a gun that could fire a 12-pound ball. When they had this part of the high, rumpled northern Rockies to themselves, they chased bison herds over drop offs or cornered them in cul de sacs where the short grass ran into basalt walls. And when the bison herds thinned and then didn't appear at all, the original people went hungry and became desperate and started to kill the new people. During a dark, cold spell known as the Starvation Winter, Blackfeet died in great numbers. At their weakest point, they were told to give up their language, their religion, and their land. It was a federal crime, subject to jail or fine, to worship the old way, an affront to speak the tongue of their grandparents. What had they done to deserve this? They had refused to stop being Niitsitapi. Thomas Marr was recalling his own people's years of starvation. His own fight against occupiers intent on emasculating a nation, outlawing a religion, banning a language. During his first journey to see the natives of Montana Territory, after descending by horseback on the bank along the great falls of the Missouri, a series of thundering cataracts that brought to a halt all upriver travel, he was a day's ride from Fort Benton. This late in the year, in the flats, the river was no longer tawny and swollen, but clear and shallow, ice forming in pools along the shore. The land was the golden brown of a Tipperary spud, dusted by snow along the north facing ridgelines, the cottonwoods bare in the canyons. Shunned by the ruling clique in Virginia City, the governor fell in again with a handful of well read Jesuit priests. In them, he found a world of acceptance and civility that he could not find in the capital. Around a campfire, he was back at Clongowes Wood, remembering much of his Latin, at Stonyhurst without the risk of getting his hand whacked by a disciplinarian in a clerical collar. The Jesuits, many of them from Europe, loved the stories of his life, which he would stretch over several winter nights, and Marr loved telling them. In the springtime of my youth was renewed, Marr said, in recalling the days of brightest happiness. The American authorities of church and state regarded the longtime inhabitants of the territory with disgust. The general condition of Indians of the Blackfeet Nation, taken in light of civilization, is degrading in the extreme, wrote Gad E. Upson, the government's Indian agent, as the go between of the native and American worlds. Upson was presumed to have some sympathy for the tribes, but he could not hide his hatred. In a similar vein, an early Catholic missionary wrote, "The Indian, as everyone knows, is a wild human being, bred in moral and material barbarism." Marr, with his keen ear for history's echoes, might have heard in such talk the British Crown during the Great Hunger. Among the Jesuits were a few men who showed more tolerance of the tribes, trying to learn their language and something of their ways, all in service of converting them to Roman Catholic Christianity. The Indians put up with the spiritual condescension with the missions rising on the buffalo grounds, in the hope of finding a powerful antidote to the plagues besetting their people. They wanted big medicine from the black robes. The native population had crashed. White ailments, cholera, smallpox, measles, to which the Indians had no immunity, took out young and old in mortal sweeps. To the north were the Blackfeet, and three related tribes, feared by Lewis and Clark, feared by their enemies, the Nez Perce and the Shoshone. Disease had taken much of the fight out of them. To the southeast were the Crow, more docile, trembling at the advance of their traditional Indian foes from the east. Looming over all were the mighty Oglala Sioux, led by Red Cloud, the most brilliant Indian tactician of the 19th century. He had proclaimed in 1866 the year to rid Montana of whites. His plan was to close the door to immigration by making the main wagon trail into the territory a war zone. At Fort Benton, more than 7,000 natives massed for a treaty session, led by Gad Upson, with the Jesuits as interpreters. Marr was an observer. He learned quickly how homelands were broken up by the government. The Blackfeet and the Piegan were expected to relinquish all land south of the Missouri and Teton rivers and east of the Milk River, the heart of some of the most bountiful bison country, to occupy a rectangle to the northwest, hard up against what would become Glacier National Park. In return, the bands would get an annuity of $5,000 and each chief would be paid $500 for 20 years. Many of the payments would be in farm implements. The Blackfeet, horsemen and hunters for generations, were expected to become ranchers and wheat growers. Some of the chieftains signed, others did not. As governor at the treaty session, Marr was offered gifts of buffalo robes by the tribal leaders. He turned them down. You are poor and need to keep your property, he told them. Keep it for yourselves and your children. Marr was astonished that a nation could be diminished so cheaply. The original owners of this vast domain, he noted later in a speech in Virginia City, had given up everything for a comparatively small reservation, but he did not object, not publicly. No sooner had the treaty papers with tribal X's on the signature lines been folded into the pocket of the Indian hating Indian agent Upson, then some of the Blackfeet realized they'd been taken and attacked a few white stragglers around Fort Benton. The Sioux refused to take the treaty bait. Like the Comanche in the southern plains, they used torture as a deterrent. They honed their skills on fellow Indians, cutting off noses and ears, fingers and toes, lopping penises from bodies and stuffing them into the mouths of victims. This sounds like some mafia shit. With enemy tribes, the goal was to deny them passage to the afterlife. Is that how you deny passage? In anything but a mangled body? Oh, I don't think that's how it works. Leaving them incapable of enjoying the pleasures of heaven. With whites, the aim was to plant fear and occasional cottonwood stakes in the hearts of interlopers. Throughout the second half of 1865 and into 1866, the Sioux attacked cavalrymen, wagon trains, and miners on their way to Virginia City. With more than 2,000 warriors, Red Cloud moved freely throughout the large parts of Montana and Wyoming territories. He disdained the trinkets, blankets, and money promised by the Americans. Wapomni, the bribes designed to get natives to give up their land, as well as Minnewacan, the water that makes men crazy. By early 1866, he'd been so successful that the government closed most of the Bozeman Trail, which cut north from the Oregon Trail and could save 400 miles or almost 6 weeks of a journey to the gold fields of Montana. The attack sent the population of whites into a panic. They appealed to Marr for help, and he turned to the federal government. If Marr wanted soldiers in Montana to defend against Indians, he was told that he would have to go through the man in charge of the Upper West, the commander of the Department of the Missouri, William T. Sherman. The general's opinion of the native population in the territories was little better than his opinion of the Georgians during his march to the sea, or the Irish who'd fought for him at Bull Run. We are not going to let a few thieving, ragged Indians check and stop progress, Sherman wrote to the War Department. Still, a grudge was a grudge. Envenomed Martinet and the general refused Marr's request, nor would he grant him the respect of his title. He addressed him as secretary, though Marr had been the sole governor of the territory for half a year. Marr called the legislature into session on March 5th, 1866. The House of Representatives assembled on the second floor of a saloon. The upper body met in a billiard hall. Snow buried Virginia City, but Marr warned the politicians, most of them Democrats who'd been elected under the previous governor. He said the territory should be governed free of ethnic and religious taint. Those who fought for the Confederacy were as welcome as those who had tried to kill them. Radical Republicans could find common cause with Copperhead Democrats. He reiterated his position on public schools. They should not teach religion. The lesson of Great Britain, forcing the Crown's faith on the people of Ireland, had never left him. And when Dimmesdale, the British-born editor of the Montana Post, attacked Marr for his stance, the governor fired him from his position as school superintendent. Later that year, the first public school in Montana opened in Virginia City without the King of England's Bible. He kept the frontier lawmakers furiously legislating. He also kept them fed and lubricated. His saloon bill for food and wet goods was $434 over 38 days, a sum that paid for 74 meals, 19 bottles of wine, 12 pitchers of beer, and 43 cigars. And when the legislature tried to pay Marr $2,500 in salary, he turned it down, even as his remaining personal assets were running perilously low. I do not wish to have a single dollar voted me out of territorial funds, he said. The federal government ought to provide for its officers. The governor in motion was his own force of nature, equal parts nudge, threat, and silky voiced eloquence. In the Ireland of his birth, he could not have served in Parliament without denouncing his faith. In Tasmania, the prisoner could only write by pen name from the underground, helping the ex-convicts of the penal colony force the Crown to grant them self-governance. But under the big sky of Montana, he was the executive branch, with a veto threat to back his powers of persuasion. By the close of the session, Marr sent the citizen legislatures back to their gold diggings and homestead shacks, but not until they passed 64 bills. Everything is delightful to me, Marr wrote Secretary of State William Seward, with the exception of those ill-bred bigots who vent their vexation against me in vulgar and infamous detraction. Those well-placed enemies steamed and plotted. Marr had unleashed a citizen government of populist Democrats, and the mechanics of that rough-edged democracy sent the vigilantes into fits. At the same time, they continued with their executions. In February, 2 men were strung up in the community of East Gallatin. The next month, just as the legislature convened, another man was hanged in Helena, and a fourth victim was strangled by rope in Deer Lodge, bringing the total number of vigilante killings to 46. You got a real problem. I mean, that's a real problem if you have like a ton of people in your area, but rural Montana, that's a real problem. If there was a pattern to the death sentences, it was noted that most of the victims were Democrats and laborers. A store owner who shot and killed his business partner was given a pass. Wilbur Sanders, the self proclaimed vigilante prosecutor, Republican leader, and aspiring congressional delegate, could barely contain his rage at the acting one, that's Marr, remember, for the crime of acting as governor. In a letter to a supporter about what to do with Marr, he wrote, "We must put a quietus on the doings of this pretender." The word could mean only one thing. Marr exuded invincibility. Could the vigilantes of Montana seriously hope to do to him what the British Empire, the governor of Tasmania penal colony, and the Confederate generals could not? A wanted man? Take a number. No, they'll take a number, all right. All of Virginia City, or those who could get in, packed into the People's Theater on St. Patrick's Day, 1866, to hear the orator in a mile-high performance. He did not seem like someone afraid of the noose. 16 years ago, I spent the 17th of March in the forest of Tasmania, he told the spellbound audience. It was a very beautiful island, which Her Gracious Majesty of Great Britain enabled me to visit. Having placed a sloop of war at my disposal for that delightful purpose, laughter, Marr turned serious, his voice almost a whisper. He closed his eyes to show himself in a dream state, then opened them, slowing his words to let the audience in on a secret. He was a homeless exile, he explained, as he had told Libby when asking for her hand. A man cast about on 3 continents. One thing had sustained him through the despair of the open sea aboard the Swift, through the smothering of life in the penal colony, through the butchery of friends at Mary's Heights. One thing he had figured out a way to summon Ireland in color and sound, scent and texture. No idle reminiscence. This was a trick born of internal discipline. He had practiced in the first weeks of his banishment, then mastered during his bleakest hours in Tasmania. That's like literally when they're like, go to your happy place, go to your happy place, um, like mentally, or like in A Little Princess, for she used to talk about India and how it smelled like spices. So for him, it's Ireland. The wild birds flashing and whirling over the waters were my only companions, he said of Lake Sorrel. But I peopled the lonely scene with friends who were far away and made it teem with memories and visions of the land of my birth. That lake became the Lake of Killarney. An island in the center of the lake was changed to Innisfallen, the ruined cloister of the monks, the round towers, the castles. He asked his audience to transport themselves from snowbound Montana to the spring green of Ireland. Every foreign Irishman goes home on St. Patrick's Day. Why? Every one of you are at home with me today. There's not a one of you in Montana. There's not a one of you has seen the Rocky Mountains this morning. The Rocky Mountains are gone for the day and won't be back till midnight. Laughter here for a reprieve from the siege of a 6-month winter. But even if Ireland were not beautiful, even if it were a desert, it would be mustered forth to rouse the soul of those who believed in the cause of forgotten people. We should love it. be jealous of it, be proud of it, and cling to it all the more devotedly on account of the deprivations with which it has been stricken. From passing on his trick of a memory mate in bad times to the high passion zone of any Irish immigrant, Marr moved strolling across the small stage. He faced men with scarred hands and women who scrubbed plank floors in Virginia City, people who'd been derided as harks. Give me the peasantry, the reviled, scorned, ignored peasantry of Ireland. Their wretched cabins have been holy shrines in which the traditions and hopes of Ireland have been treasured and transmitted. Never, never let the Irish heart give up the hope of seeing on Irish soil the fatal destinies of centuries reversed, and a restored nation, wisely instructed and ennobled in the school of sorrow planted there. The roar inside the theater lasted for several minutes. Marr, unable to continue, when he picked up again, he turned on those who thought that Irish and American could never be one and the same. He was talking to the know-nothings, to the vigilantes, to Peter Townsend's. There are some vicious bigots, men of small brains and smaller hearts, men of more gall than blood, who even here assert that love of Ireland, devotion to her cause, active sympathy with the protracted contest for her redemption, revoke an unequivocal allegiance to the United States. The boos rang out, "Not here." He called for calm, the better for the crowd to hear his answer. The vow of the immigrant doubted his Chickahominy, the slope, or doubted his citizenship sealed in blood. Let the woods and swamps of the deadly Chickahominy, the slopes of Malvern Hill, the waters of Antietam, the defiant heights of Fredericksburg, the thickets of the wilderness, a thousand fields now billowed with Irish graves, declare that love for Ireland blends in ecstasy with loyalty to America. But such loyalty was not unquestioning. Yes, the United States was a wonderful country, a refuge for those who would have died of starvation at home. But there were too many in this new nation who were empty of love for something greater. It is the soulless American who has no heart, who has no thought beyond putting a mighty dollar out at mighty interest, who has no zest for any other book than his soulless ledger. When he uttered these words, Marr himself was broke. He had mm, turned down a salary from the territorial legislature, hoping that the federal government would eventually pay him what he was owed, but they hadn't. Traveling to the West in search of a fortune, he found only new battles to fight, variants of his persistent lifelong struggle to grant dignity to those without it. No matter, in his mind, the bigots were doomed, the soulless rich more so. He closed on a hopeful note. Any other way would have been out of character. Ireland and the United States, hand in hand down the great road of time, would always be on the side of the freedomless, the beggared, and the crushed. His ardor for the old country did not escape notice outside the drafty interiors of Virginia City. In Waterford, the press proclaimed Marr the head of a large Irish nationalist movement in the American West. He was back, this time as leader of the immigrant masses on the far frontier, poised to strike the empire in its territory up north. His plans are said to divide the Fenian army into two immense bodies, and with one to invade Canada. But the English knew better. They had infiltrated the Fenian ranks in Dublin, suspending habeas corpus yet again, and did not find their old foe from young Ireland to be among the leaders of the biggest threat to British rule since 1848. Still, the Crown had good reason to keep track of the fugitive Thomas Marr. While Marr did his fighting with words, the Fenians took to battle. They struck Canada in the late spring of 1866. Oh, did they? Sending 1,000 Irish Americans across the Niagara River at Buffalo into Ontario. The invading force, Civil War veterans, itinerant laborers, new immigrants, fought a company of the Queen's Own Rifles and seized Fort Erie on June 1st. The plan was to hit key locations in New Brunswick, Quebec, Ontario, and Manitoba at the same time. But the attack was poorly coordinated and executed. At Fort Erie, the Irish were led by John O'Neill, a former captain in the U.S. cavalry. They were prepared to fight English troops for control of the Union Jack's redoubt. Instead, they skirmished with a Canadian militia, 840 volunteers. By the third day, with their supply lines cut by an American naval ship, the Fenians retreated back across the river to the United States. They were promptly arrested. The invasion of Canada a bust. Libby arrived on June 5th, 1866. After 65 days on a steamboat, that is a long trip to Fort Benton, about 2,600 river miles. Husband and wife had been apart for nearly a year. He had lost some of the snap in his life, complaining of stomach ailments and trouble sleeping. The pain of a serious skin burn from a campfire was ever present. She had put on weight during the long weeks of sedentary travel, but her physical beauty at the age of 35 could still impress. She is a fine-looking woman with the blackest eyes and the queenliest presence and the prettiest face I've seen in the mountains, wrote the territory's Episcopal Bishop Daniel Tuttle. The cleric was struck by her mind as well. The acting First Lady of Montana was clever, smart, quick in conversation, he noted. Marr was overjoyed to be back in the arms of my dear Lib. She had to love her pioneer husband after he escorted her to the governor's residence. Their new home was the leaky log cabin in a town that could collapse in a sneeze. Tiny, mouse-infested, and primitive the shack may have been, but with two Mars now occupying the crude cabin, it became a parlor. The gubernatorial residence for um, or the gubernatorial mansion, they dubbed it. A picture was commissioned of the executive residence for laughs and posterity. They hosted poetry readings and and nights of backgammon and claret. The educated talk moving outside on summer evenings when light glowed in the mountains till a few hours short of midnight. Also, to the alarm of the Masonic Temple, the Mars buttressed the Catholic community, lobbying the church to send a bishop to tend to the growing ranks of immigrant faithful. The Mars fought as well. Money was now a serious problem. Libby's father had always provided a residence in New York for the couple, but little else. Another Townsend daughter, Alice, who had become wealthy by her marriage to Samuel Barlow, was part of one of the richest couples in the United States. Barlow kept a finger dipped in banks, railroads, war contracts, and presidential politics. Marr had nothing. His earnings were from speaking, and he had done precious little of that for pay. since becoming a warrior and politician. Montana's motto was bottom line oro y plata. Marr had neither gold nor silver. He still intended to invest in a mine or some land, but he never found the time. Tangling with the vigilantes and trying to get the new territory on its feet had consumed him. What he wanted the most, he said, was to be a man who brought honor to his people. The Irish Brigade, the soldiers sacrificed his own near death experiences facing Confederate musketry should have been enough, but he still had to prove himself. It is my ambition, he wrote a friend, to be the representative and champion of the Irish race in the wild great mountains. New Ireland, though, was slow to fill. His enemy Sanders had been put in his place, or so it seemed. He he was roundly defeated in an election that year for territorial delegate to Congress. The rebuff to Montana's leading Republican was seen as an endorsement of Marr by the voters. Unable to govern legitimately, the Vigilance Committee that Sanders had guided killed another round of men by secret edicts in mid 1866. Leander Johnson was hanged by Deer Lodge, accused of a want of appreciation of the law. No small irony, J.L. Goons was strung up in German Gulch. A man named Frenchy Couchet was hanged in Helena a few days after Libby's arrival with a note, robber and perjurer, pinned to his body. At the same time, Sanders also plotted to bring a new governor to Virginia City. Montana Republicans leaned on leaders of their party in Washington to appoint someone who fell in line with the Freemasons and other upstanding people in the territory. A proper replacement was promised by the fall. Throughout the summer and into October of 1866, Marr set out to introduce Libby to those wild great mountains while also gathering material for an assignment from Harper's Weekly. If he was afraid, he didn't show it. He'd killed for the Union. He'd promised to kill for Ireland. He would kill to defend himself. Every day intensifies my hatred of the radicals, he wrote Barlow. Here in Montana, they have ever since my arrival been violently endeavoring to do on a smaller scale what the states they have virtually succeeded in doing. That is, disorganizing and paralyzing the government because they could not control it. The Mars crossed over the Continental Divide, went west into the drainage of the Blackfoot River to the Clark Fork, near running streams a few days removed from snowmelt, rushing to join the Columbia, which empties more water into the Pacific than any river in the Western Hemisphere. At sunset, occasional storms passed through. More often was a show of alpenglow along the ridges that lined up like sentinels. North from Hell Gate Village, renamed Missoula that year, the Mars traveled through the Flatland Valley, gazing on the big lake of the same name. He found Jesuits again at the mission of St. Ignatius, lonely black robes working in the shadow of the imposing wall of the mission range. Wandering among those peaks, Mar named a waterfall for the love of his life. But the closing of the season of light, with snow flying again on the journey back to Virginia City and ice forming in the creek beds, brought fresh intrigue and no checks from the government. Now Marr was desperate. More than $2,500 in debt, he turned to a friend, Cornelius O'Keefe, for a loan of $1,000. What he had in collateral was his way with words. Marr would file his Harper's piece under O'Keefe's byline, a great ego boost for a man trying to make a name in the territory. Marr didn't want to grovel. I want to return to Virginia City a proud and independent Irish gentleman, having no one insult or even give me the cold shoulder because I owe a miserable little bill of 50 or $100, he wrote O'Keefe. I want my countrymen to place me up and beyond the sneers of these blackguards who are ever ready to run down an Irishman. Back in the capital, the town was abuzz over the arrival of a well regarded gentleman, the new governor, Green Clay Smith. He was from Kentucky, a member of Congress, a Protestant, evangelical Christian, and a teetotaler who dreamed of a day when all of the United States would be dry. He was everything Marr was not, and everything the right thinking people of the territory could hope for. Around Governor Smith, Marr was himself, chatty, solicitous, funny, dropping an allusion to Obed here and a quote from Thomas Jefferson there. The new man was charmed. As it turned out, they had several things in common. Smith had been a general in the Union Army, like Marr. He had led men to death against the slaveholding republic. They had shared a love of certain authors, a habit of summoning a line or verse to good effect, and a governing philosophy. Several times they stayed up past 1 a.m. talking about history. In short order, the Irish Catholic tippler and the non drinking evangelical were fast friends. Green Clay Smith is in complete accord with me, Marr confided to Barlow. He is a genial, bright hearted, high minded fellow. But Smith had no sooner arrived than he decided to leave. Just like the first governor, he promised to be back in half a year. Leave he did, barely 3 months after arriving, giving full power back to Marr, who resumed his title of the acting one. His enemies hit him twice, first with great force and then less so. In early 1867, Wilbur Sanders traveled to Washington on a mission to cripple his Montana rival. The midterm elections of 1866 had given Republicans more power than they ever had in Congress. In the House, they held 174 of 224 seats. At the same time, they started impeachment proceedings against the unloved president, Democrat Andrew Johnson. Doors in the Capitol opened for Sanders. This Marr fellow, the great Irish general, the acting one, was a fraud, Sanders claimed, and had to be shut down. In response, Congress passed a sweeping measure. It nullified the legislative session of Montana. All laws and acts passed in the 1866 Assembly were held to be null and void. An extraordinary and unprecedented action, as the Western historian Gary Forney called it. Back in Montana, in case Marr didn't get the message about power in the territory, vigilantes issued another death warrant. They hanged a man, his last name Rosenbaum, tagged to his body for reasons unexplained. No arrest, no trial, no due process, no last words. In the fall, Rosenbaum had been whipped and told that he was banished from Montana. but he refused to move out of the territory and paid for it with his life. Marr had been given a similar message. Riding from Virginia City to Helena, he was stopped by a posse of vigilantes. Did he not understand the note attached to the dangling corpse of James Daniels? Leave Montana, they told the Irishman. Leave. Afterward, a crude drawing was dropped off at the governor's cabin. It pictured a body hanging from a tree and a noose around a name, General Marr. Well, at least they called him General. Chapter 22, River Without End. Summer, 1867. The Missouri held fresh snow melt still. It was fat and full of swagger. Riding all day with a small party traveling north to Fort Benton, Marr was sick, unable to keep his food down, his stomach convulsive. The clop of horses raised swarms of grasshoppers and drew biting flies and blood-sucking mosquitoes. Days were cloudless, hot and slow. The sky, white with heat in the afternoon torpor. He'd left his wife in Helena, promising to return in about 2 weeks. When they were together, his pain passed, and they could laugh and make love and pretend that life in New Ireland was working. He missed old Ireland. He wanted to see what his son was like. He'd written to his father a week ago. Oh, thank you, Jerry. Congratulations. Inquiring about young Thomas and Waterford. Yes, he could summon the land of his birth and people in it using his great mental trick, but he missed the touch. He wanted to dip his toe in the sewer, to sit with Duffy and Speranza, to sing a rebel song in Kilkenny, to climb Misery Mountain and look down on the home of 3 living generations of Mars. He'd been away almost 20 years, had lived nearly half his life as an exile. In late afternoon, his ass chapped from the saddle, his back sore, his face sunburned, his stomach snarling, he looked around at the flat-top mesas, treeless and brown, gazed up at that infinity of sky, and wondered how he got there, so far from home. And what would his father think of him now? Judged by accumulated wealth, not much. In a note to the territorial auditor, Marr begged for the pay denied him over nearly 2 years as governor. I am utterly, utterly out of funds. It was humiliating to admit, even harder to commit to paper. He could not ask his father for help. He was well past that. The elder Marr never understood his rebel son acting on principle instead of just pretending to act, as most people did. Young Marr believed in luck and lost causes. The old man followed the rules, even if the rules kept Ireland in bondage. Member of Parliament, mayor of his hometown, living well in a family manor stuffed with inherited riches from the merchant life, the rules rewarded him to a point. If he could see the creaky assemblage of logs in Virginia City that the one-time Prince of Waterford called home, he would be appalled. So his son is living well. He's not. Marr's mission the last week of June was joyless. Go to Fort Benton to pick up a cache of arms for use against the native inhabitants. After much resistance, General Sherman had agreed to send weapons for defense of the territory. This after Red Cloud's warriors had whipped the army in December of 1866. They had lured Captain William Fetterman out of his post at Fort Phil Kearny in northern Wyoming and directly into an ambush. 80 men were killed, their eyes gouged, heads scalped, bodies mutilated for good effect. One of the few times an Indian army had annihilated the Americans. Fetterman had served under Sherman in Georgia. The general swore revenge. We must act with vindictive earnestness against the Sioux, even to their extermination, men, women, and children, he wrote. With Red Cloud's victory, the rest of the Bozeman Trail was closed to all travel, choking the route of pioneers who insisted on going to Montana the short way. The forts along the trail would soon be abandoned. For one final time, the bison grounds belonged to the Sioux, the last big swath of Indian country completely in the hands of native people. But John Bozeman, an ambitious hulk of a frontiersman, founder of the town, and the shortcut named for him, would have none of it. In April, Bozeman and several white men ventured out along the off limits trail astride the Yellowstone River. There, he was killed by Indians, or so it was reported, a sensational murder that put the territory on edge. Somehow, Bozeman's business rival, who was with him at the time, Thomas Cover, escaped, and it was he who blamed the killing on the Blackfeet, though he may have had a hand in the death himself. A call for war against the natives, Blackfeet, Sioux, Arapaho, Northern Cheyenne, went up in Virginia City. It is high time that the sickly sentimentalism about humane treatment and conciliatory measures should be consigned to novel writers, wrote the Montana Post. If the Indians continue their barbarities, wipe them out. Marr organized a militia and galloped off in a dust swirl to fight the tribes. But his heart wasn't in it. He ventured east into the nerve-wracked Gallatin Valley and found no hostiles. On a swing to the north and west, he was supposed to kill Indians of any tribe. The Jesuits urged him to show some mercy, to not fire a shot unless he was fired upon. Red Cloud was the Indian Mar of the sword, said one of the priests. He honored their request. A reporter noted that Mar didn't have to fight. He will quiet the Indians by talking their heads off. As summer's dawn, the militia had disbanded without bloodshed. By the time he dismounted at the Sun River Junction with the Missouri in late June, Marr had been on a horse in one form of service to Montana or another for almost 2 months. He could go no further, he said, whatever it was that ailed him, a serious internal disease, dysentery, typhus. He felt terrible. For 6 days he didn't move, coiled in the pre-dawn cold around the last embers of a fire, sweating through the blistering sun by day. He decided he was done with politics in the Rocky Mountains. The governor, Green Clay Smith, would be back any day. On his arrival, I shall be free and right glad, Marr wrote Barlow, for I am downright sick of serving the government in a civil capacity. The Democrats had urged him to run for territorial delegate to the U.S. Senate, his for the asking, given the majority political sentiment of Montana. He turned them down. I'm not rich enough yet to support the grand responsibilities of that position. He wrote his brother-in-law. Barlow was in on the joke. At this point, he knew that the great Irish general, was a pauper. On July 1st, Marr roused himself for a final push to Fort Benton. at the bony footings of the mountains in the north. Several steamships were at anchor. The town was jumping with gamblers, prospectors, washed up slaveholders, missionaries, Indian killers, liquor merchants, prostitutes, soldiers, mercenaries for various causes, Mar haters and Mar lovers. The general was instantly recognized as he hobbled down the boardwalk fronting the Missouri. Every other establishment was a saloon or an inducement device. A woman named Madame Mustache ran the jungle, a place for a man to get a quick poke and a pop of corn whiskey, while Lily's squaw danced in a false fronted shack next to the euphemistically named Board of Trade, catered to similar clientele. Men who recognized Marr pointed at him, staring. They turned away, muttering what sounded to the governor like a threat. There he goes. Sweating and exhausted, Marr went to the home of the merchant I.G. Baker, an adobe cabin that doubled as a store, 2 rooms under a sod roof. Bad news greeted him. His back pay, which was supposed to have been forwarded to Baker's residence, had not arrived, nor had Sherman's shipment of guns. The weapons were stuck downriver, another 100 miles or so. Marr tried to hold down lunch with Baker inside the cooling refuge of his home, the finest in Fort Benton, with its whitewashed 3 foot thick walls and timbered, rough hewn beams overhead. The merchant offered Marr blackberry wine as a palliative. At midday, a well dressed man with a pointed beard poked his head in the door, acting on a rumor that had rumbled through the river port. General Marr? It was Wilbur Sanders. The vigilante leader had just returned from his trip to the nation's capital, having thrown out the work of the legislative session Marr had labored so hard on. And here was the governor himself, still defiant, still conducting official business, not dead beyond all hope of recognition, but unbowed. Sanders was solicitous, seeking to join Marr and Baker. Men of political disagreement could still share a meal, yes. Surely Marr was ready to give up this New Ireland nonsense and the promotion of Catholic immigrants to the territory. And what was this with his animus toward the Freemasons? Marr had called them pimps and bigots in a speech. They were know-nothings in cowboy hats. See here, as the recently elevated Grand Master of the Masonic Temple in all of Montana, Sanders could assure his rival that the defenders of pure blood Americanism were only getting stronger on the frontier. Resistance was futile. The establishment order would prevail. Marr had to be surprised to bump into the man he called the most vicious of my enemies in this upriver outpost. Pure coincidence? Perhaps. The governor waved off his rival, retreating to the back room of Baker's house to read the paper, work on official business, and answer some correspondence. In a weakened hand, Marr wrote Richard O'Gorman in New York. They'd been schoolboys together at Clongowes Wood, rebels during young Ireland's rise in the face of the Great Hunger, and fellow Manhattan lawyers. Marr sketched a plan to travel with Libby to Europe, do some speaking about his Civil War experiences, and see if there was a back door into Ireland. He wanted to look into the eyes of the son he had never met. He could count on friends in high places. Some of the leading figures from the 1848 uprising were now pillars of society, a few members of parliament among them. Speranza was more influential than ever. Her house in Dublin was one of the liveliest parlors in Europe. But Marr was conflicted. He and Libby were mostly happy. Montana could still be home for his people. He was not done yet with the dream of New Ireland. The pilot of the G.A. Thompson, tied up on the riverfront outside Baker's store, interrupted him. Johnny Doran was electrified. Mm, mm. At the chance to meet the Irish American patriot. Also, he had guided the stern whaler that brought Libby to Fort Benton a year earlier. Marr was grateful to the riverman for bringing his wife safely back to him. And how was the missus? Very well, Marr said. He was just dashing off a note to her now. The brutal 2-week ride to Fort Benton was his last official mission. He'd be home with Lib soon and free of public service. Doran invited Marr to dine with him in the comfort of his riverboat and spend the night in a guest room. Marr explained that he wasn't well. Doran insisted they had many things to talk about. For one, British authorities were supposedly on their way to Fort Benton, if not already there, to look into reports of another Fenian plot against the Empire. An Irish American cavalry soldier said to be a Fenian had killed a British Army captain a few days earlier aboard one of the Missouri River steamboats. Shot in the head, the victim was a nobleman of some rank and wealthy. For another, Doran had decent library on his ship. With that, Mark perked up. Fresh literature, as always, was a bigger draw than fresh food. In the evening, belted kingfishers swoop for trout over the wide, swift expanse of the Missouri, gliding just above the water line. As the heat broke, the river fell under the shadow of high, beveled cliffs. On one side, white-tailed deer foraged in the shallows, and pelicans scanned the surface for the dimples of rising fish. Tree limbs, broken off logs, and other bits of flotsam rushed by. Across the way and downstream, exposed tiers of the ages were burnished in the last sunlight of the high mesas. Over a light meal, Marr and Johnny Doran talked of Ireland and the navigational tricks of the upper Missouri, of Gaelic poets and death on Mary's Heights. As sick as Marr was, he could still tell a story, still bring a stranger to tears of outrage or laughter, even an audience of one. But he was not himself. The charm was forced. He was preoccupied, sensing that mortal danger was at hand. Of all the ports in all the world, Marr found himself in one at 2,700 feet above sea level, where the enemies of his life, the crown, the dregs of the Confederacy, vigilantes, lurked nearby. Ah, but not just enemies, friends as well, Irishmen, Fenians at the American fort, in uniform, Johnny Doran. After their dinner, they crossed the gangplank back to town for a leisurely stroll over cigars along Front Street. Again, Marr noticed the stares and murmurs of men who looked away when he tried to meet their gaze. Johnny, they threatened my life in that town. As the last light melted at dusk, the two men retreated back to the steamship. The pilot tried to reassure Marr he had a pair of pistols he could lend him for the night, and even more comfort, a riveting book as promised, The Collegians, a thriller set in rural Ireland written by Gerald Griffin. The author had died young, but his novel enjoyed a long life in all parts of the English-speaking world. Johnny Doran escorted Mar to the stateroom on the port side, open to the river on the upper deck. Mar insisted that Doran stay with him for a time, but Doran had some business to attend to. He left him with the novel that took Mar in his last hour back to his homeland. About 10 p.m., a crewman on the lower deck of the G.A. Thompson heard a cry and a splash. The night was windless with a strong moon. Sound carried across the open surface of the river. He said he heard gasps, a gurgling sound, a desperate noise of struggle. Man overboard! Johnny Doran knew immediately that it was Mar, the only occupant of the guest stateroom. He considered jumping in and then not, for it would be almost certain death. He ordered lights cast on the river, threw out boards attached to ropes. Doran ran to the shore and raced downstream, calling out. The final sounds he heard were two agonizing cries from the man, the first one very short, the last prolonged. The pilot waded hip deep into the river, holding the ship's paddle wheel as a tether. Small boats were launched, but they found not a trace of Thomas Marr. It fell to Wilbur Sanders to announce the death and shape the story that would be told for generations to come. Poor fellow, our acting governor, had gone to an early grave. Marr was the most brilliant conversationalist he'd ever met, said Sanders. And the sudden death of one so full of life, such a pity. A suicide, he implied. Sanders said he had shared warm words with the Irishman that day, an afternoon delightfully spent. At night, as Sanders told the story, he saw the governor again on Front Street, and this time it was apparent he was deranged, loudly demanding a revolver to defend himself. Why, he could not imagine. The vigilante leader, the man Marr most despised in Montana, escorted his enemy to his stateroom and all but tucked him in, so he said. But Johnny Doran, who actually did put Marr to bed, said nothing of that sort happened. It was just Doran and Marr. This would not come out until later. Sanders then went back to town in his telling, and about 30 minutes later heard the shocking news that the governor had drowned. During that same half hour, Sanders, or a hired killer, could have crept into Marr's room. It was not heavily guarded. Sanders claimed that a witness told him Marr had jumped into the water in his nightclothes. Jumped on his own. Sanders sent these details out with the Evening Post, leaving at 11 p.m. for Helena. They searched into the morning, searched all day, and the following one up and down the banks of the Missouri, dragging the river. Governor Smith, now back in the territory, immediately authorized a $1,000 reward for the recovery of the body. He praised the general as a gentleman and a friend, recalling their late-night talks. In Virginia City and Helena, people crowded into assembly halls to mourn the best-known Irish American in the country. Nobody believed the Sanders version of the disappearance. Suicide? Though he quarreled with the high clergy, Mark was a Catholic by culture and faith. He would never kill himself. Nor did they believe that he tripped over a coil of rope on deck, as others said, falling to his death. Even if he did fall, Mark was a strong swimmer. All his life he'd been around water. He grew up on the River Suir, went to his first Jesuit school along the Liffey, endured his banishment on the shores of Lake Sorrel, escaped the penal colony in the treacherous swells of Bass Strait, led soldiers through the rain swollen or the rain swollen hold of the Chickahominy in Tasmania. He had offered to swim to his rescue boat. Had his pirate friends not offered to take him? No, the Missouri currents, strong enough they were, could not alone take Marr to his grave. Even when sick, he was robust, with an oaken barrel of an upper body, a stubborn bastard. More likely he was assassinated. These friends of Marr believed citizens of Helena packed into the same theater where, a few months earlier, Marr had given a stirring lecture on the Irish Brigade. They put together a fund to find the killer, grew it to 10 times what the governor was offering. They passed a resolution, reprinted in papers throughout the nation, that in his death our country has lost a true patriot, a friend of universal liberty, a sympathizer with the oppressed of all nations, a foe to tyranny. The governor ordered 30 days of official mourning. Now Marr's enemies were among the most effusive in praise. No more talk of a drunk, whoremonger, or tyrant. There was nothing in his faults to extinguish the fire of great virtues, wrote one Republican leader who had battled Marr in the territory. The Irishman was a ripe scholar, said the Montana Post, which had slandered him at every turn. Courteous, amiable, and hospitable. Throughout the East, in Marr clubs, Marr bands, and Marr militia units, in New York and Boston and Philadelphia, wherever lived the men who'd been soldiers in the Irish Brigade, there was disbelief. What they knew of the Waterford rebel, some of it legend, much of it factual, was that he had lapped the globe on a wave of immortality. The ancient gods of his homeland always had his back. The man was never quiet, never still, never slow, never far from history's front edge. The idea of his death now, at age 43, by an accident, that was no match for the life lived. This was preposterous. The Irish American hagiographer at first, then an opponent, and now again on Marr's side, published a commemorative poem among its many tributes. And is the patriot Marr dead, who in his youthful glory rose, a champion of his race, and led his country against his foes? His childhood friend Richard O'Gorman, recipient of what may have been Marr's last letter, was aghast at the loss. At the Cooper Union in New York, where Abraham Lincoln had given the speech that made him a national figure, where Red Cloud would make a plea for independence of the Sioux Nation, a huge crowd converged on a hot night in August to remember Marr's life. Earlier that day, a requiem mass was held at St. Francis Xavier Church. Veterans of the Irish Brigade lined either side of a portrait of their leader, each man wearing a sprig of green boxwood in his lapel. He is gone, O'Gorman said in his eulogy. The pitiless Missouri, hurrying fast to sea, has enwrapped him in a watery shroud and dug him a lonely grave beneath its turgid waters. The hall was bedecked with flags of the brigade, the United States, and the tricolor that Marr had designed for the country of his birth. O'Gorman told the story of an outsized life, the basic profile familiar to most, the details not. A boy of wealth and standing had risked it all for Ireland. The famine made him a revolutionary. The voice made him famous, a trumpet blast to rouse the whole island. In the docket at Clonmel came a speech that would long outlive him. I know this crime entails the penalty of death, but the history of Ireland explains this crime and justifies it. Then, shackled and forced off to the end of the world, the loneliness, the escape, finding his way in New York. Always, Marr was propelled by a desire to put a dent in history. His was a mind that needed the inspiration of great purpose. Said O'Gorman, to see the great game of life played by other hands and to stand by inactive and only watch was to die a living death. That great purpose came with the Civil War. The mortal conflict against the slaveholders was not his fight, nor that of the Irish, but he made it his and theirs. In doing so, they became Americans. Be proud of the Irish Brigade. Be proud of him who led it. 3,000 men were in the brigade when it went to war. 500 were all that left it. And was the general not flawed in ways large and small? His faults lie gently upon him, for he had faults all of us have. O'Gorman closed with a final aspiration for his mate through nearly 4 decades. Would that his grave were on some Irish hillside with the green turf above him. The widow, Elizabeth Marr, left the territory in late summer, never sure what happened to her husband, never to leave letters or diaries behind for glimpses into her heart. His death ended a life adventure for her. She was the only person who could keep up with him. She had rescued him in his lowest moments, had said yes to the uncertain destiny he was always following, had curbed his excesses when he was full of self pity or vanity. They never had a child together, but she adopted Ireland's struggle. Now orphaned in this raw and violent place, Libby departed by steamboat from Fort Benton down the river that would become his grave. His body was never found. Wilbur Sanders could be reasonably sure that in a few months Marr would be forgotten, and in a few years he might be a footnote, his words never to inhabit the beautiful high territory that had been his last home. As Sanders would have it, the story of the end of Thomas Francis Marr, the story that took hold, was tragic and fitting and uncomplicated. But that story has not stood up in the nearly century and a half that has passed since his death. Chapter 23, In Quest for Ireland. I'm nearly sure that he was killed. Um, the fact that he was unwell made him maybe an easier to kill, made it more likely, like, to not, to win in, I don't want to say an official duel, but I don't think he died from that. To end up overboard. Uh, on the 4th of July, 1905. Oh, so now how many years is this now? 30 something, I think. One one of the largest crowds in Montana assembled in front of the Capitol in Helena to unveil a statue. A procession led by a band marched from Last Chance Gulch to the government grounds where it was greeted by women in white dresses with bonnets, men in crisp suits, and hundreds of miners who had contributed their earnings for this memorial. The idea had the backing of Marcus Daly, the copper magnate from Butte and the most powerful Irish American capitalist in the United States. When deep veins of the metal used in wiring in every town were found just below the surface near the Continental Divide, Butte was transformed into an industrial hive, known as the richest hill on earth. Daly recruited Irish immigrants to his mines and paid them well. They came in droves, the sons and daughters of people who had survived the Great Hunger. It was a hard town, hazardous and dirty, winter cold for half a year. But the Irish flourished there, establishing literary societies and patriotic clubs, opera houses and theaters, schools and churches, raising large families in two-story houses. In the Rocky Mountains, their stories found a home. At one point, more Gaelic was spoken in Daly's mind than anywhere on this side of the Atlantic. New Ireland, when it finally came to the American West, was Butte, Montana. Elizabeth Marr had sent her regrets. I'm there in spirit, she wrote by telegraph from her home in Rye, Westchester County, north of New York City. She had returned to Montana but once, in the summer of 1887, to visit Yellowstone National Park. She was informed, as later scholars would discover, that her husband's suggestion that the area be explored and considered a preserve of some sort had contributed in a small way to the formation of what would become the world's first national park. Cut out of her father's inheritance by her marriage to Marr, she lived modestly in a small cottage, subsisting on a Civil War widow's pension of $50 a month. She never remarried, never stopped stoking the memory of the Irishman whose life became hers. At the noon hour, silence fell over the Capitol grounds in Helena. The Declaration of Independence was read, every miner's head nodding at the fistful of fighting words aimed at England. A still moment followed. On command, solemn faced men removed the large American flag that had been wrapped around an imposing object. The crowd gasped. There stood a bronze equestrian statue mounted on a massive block of granite. It was Thomas Francis Marr, forever young, forever defiant, facing the distant Big Belt Mountains and the waters of the Missouri. Chiseled on the side were excerpts from the 1846 speech he gave in Dublin at the age of 22. His attempt to rouse the starving to resistance. A few blocks away, Wilbur Sanders was huddled inside his three-story manse. That fucker still around? Close enough to hear the music and cheers that went up during the dedication of Mar's life. He was dying, and probably knew that he might not live to see summer's end. For almost 40 years, Sanders had been determined to have the last word. He had co-founded the Montana Historical Society, serving as its president for a quarter century. In that position, he guided an accepted narrative of how the land under the big sky was settled by righteous pioneers. The version of Montana's early days that children would learn would come from the vigilante Wilbur Sanders. In A History of Montana, the author wrote that the killers Sanders had unleashed were a force for good, the summary executions necessary, the hangings all justified, for they had the support of every decent, law abiding citizen of the community. The writer was Helen Sanders, daughter in law of Wilbur, who presumably had an easy job of sourcing. The Freemasons worked with the vigilantes in secret to assure this order, she explained, and if they got a few things wrong, if an innocent man was strangled to death or a family banished without cause, If the Constitution was trampled on, so be it. The planting of civilization, like all experiments, is subject to many mutations, miscarriages, and much mistaken toil. Wilbur Sanders had said in a Pioneer Day address in 1903, in the burnished twilight of his final years, Sanders had added a few details to his story of what happened to Thomas Marr. On the day of his disappearance, he recalled, the Irishman was his talkative self. General Marr seemed at his best in a conversational way, Sanders said, but he resolutely and undeviatingly declined that form of hospitality with which Fort Benton then abounded. That is, he didn't drink, gamble, or buy himself a whore, a backhanded compliment at best. He next saw the general at sunset, and by then he was a different man, not drunk, but mad. Sanders had no idea why Marcel felt so defensive, loudly demanding a revolver to defend himself against the citizens of Fort Benton, who, in his disturbed mental condition, he declared were hostile to him. Sanders claimed again that he helped escort Marr to his stateroom on the starboard side of the boat. He saw him change to night clothes and put to bed. We did not apprehend there would be further trouble, and it was Sanders who broke the awful news to the general's wife, implying that Marr had killed himself. It seemed my duty to tell her the sad story. All of this came from a man who had insisted barely a year before his death that we must put a quietus on Thomas Marr. Among those who had been with Marr, there's a on that last day, no one backed the Sanders story. He has been charged by the ungenerous with suicide, but with no grounds of possibility, said I.G. Baker, the merchant who welcomed Marr into his house on July 1st, 1867. He spoke years later to an Army officer who was compiling a history of Fort Benton. Logic alone reinforced Baker's conclusion, for what man of words would leave the world without a final word? What man ready to close out his final day would write his best friend on that day to outline ambitious plans for the future? A speaking tour of Europe, a family reunion, meeting a son for the first time. What suicidal husband would send a note of routine details to the love to his wife? And what taker of his own life would cry for help in the grip of the river that carried him away? Marr did not kill himself. That seems clear. But this leaves another explanation that some of those closest to him could never believe, that he died in a tipsy tumble from the deck of the G.A. Thompson. It's easy to blame it all on a drunken fall, as if that were the only fatal destiny for an Irishman that lived large. But that version also conflicts with witness accounts. The merchant baker said Marr drank only the medicinal pouring of blackberry wine he'd given him for his stomach troubles in the afternoon. I am prepared to state that he was stone cold sober, Baker said in 1901. Doran, the river pilot, said the same thing. In his eulogy, Richard O'Gorman had told of an ordinary ending for a most extraordinary man. Marr tripped and fell. Drink was not involved. Perhaps it was a coiled rope that snagged him, or the deck railings had been damaged earlier, as had been reported. But these versions do not explain Marr's lack of an apparent struggle to save himself. If he fell on his own, sober or intoxicated, and shouted for help, he was conscious enough to make for the shore or stay afloat long enough to land on one of the many small islands and sandbars just downstream. The Missouri currents at Fort Benton were strong, but white water they were not. A decent swimmer could make some progress moving to shallow depths, and Mark was more than a decent swimmer. A few of Sanders' other recollections give credence inadvertently to the assassination theory. Marr was fearing for his life, calling for a gun to defend himself, and suspicion of those skulking around the bloodiest block in the West. Why would Marr, a man whose unerring sense of survival had never failed him through a lifetime of peril, loudly demand a revolver if he had not seen killers in the shadows? And the notion that Sanders, fresh from the trip to Washington, where he had manipulated the undoing of all the legislative work of his arch enemy, would join Marr solely for convivial conversation, seems a fabrication at best. Also, Sanders got at least one significant detail wrong. He said he put Marr to bed on the starboard side of the steamship facing down. This claim was at odds with all eyewitnesses. If Marr had fallen from the starboard side, he would have been only a few feet from shore, an easy swim. How could Sanders be so wrong about the side of the boat where Marr was put to bed? One explanation emerged a few years later. On May 29th, 1913, a newspaper in Missoula printed the startling confession of a man calling himself Frank Diamond, an aging convict, sick and facing death. Diamond told the paper he'd been paid $8,000 by the vigilantes to murder Marr on the night of July 1st, 1867. The blood money was an enormous sum in the day. Diamond said he pushed the governor into the river, then slipped away in the commotion of man overboard. Here was the break the Irish had been waiting for, justification for a half century of suspicion. Did Sanders not know whereabouts of Marr's guest room because it was Diamond bankrolled by vigilantes who had been to Marr's room in his final minutes? And did Sanders concoct a story about Marr committing suicide to divert any suspicion from his own role in a murder plot? The answers awaited a formal inquiry, but within a few days of the convict's story appearing, Diamond's health recovered, facing prosecution for a homicide case with no statutes of limitation. He recanted the confession, saying he must have been hallucinating. Finally, Sanders appears to have lied about breaking the news of Marr's death to the widow, a Catholic priest, not the vigilante leader notified Libby of her loss, according to several Montana newspapers. As for motive, Sanders desperately wanted to be the territorial representative to Congress. Marr stood in the way, and Sanders probably knew nothing of Marr's last minute intention to get out of politics. Statehood was on the way eventually, meaning a pair of Senate seats would open up. Had he run a Democrat from a place where Republicans were a feeble minority, Marr would have crushed Sanders. He was the best known man in Montana, and judging by the crowds that turned out for his speeches, the lines snaking down dust-choked wagon roads outside halls that had warmed with his words and his wit, he was revered. Sanders, after being rejected by voters 5 times in various runs for office, was finally named a U.S. Senator in 1890 by Republicans in the Montana legislature. His seat was disputed from the start. He served 1 term and was ousted in a re-election bid. Sanders was never forced to explain the many contradictions in his telling of Marr's final night. By the time the Frank Diamond story broke, it was too late for a prosecutor to formally question Sanders. The vigilante leader had died in 1905, 3 days after the statue of Thomas Marr was unveiled in Helena. From that week onward, no governor, legislator, lobbyist, or citizen could walk up the steps of the Montana Capitol without passing the imposing sculpture of the Irish Revolutionary. Nor could some of them ever forget the mystery surrounding Marr's death. And so on June 9th, 2012, at the courthouse of the hollowed out little town of Virginia City, a coroner's inquest was staged as a play, using all the available evidence. Paul Wiley, an attorney, author, and Montana historian, felt the need to close a circle. Since no original inquest had ever been done, he assembled a real judge, lawyers, and medical professionals to examine Marr's last night. Witnesses were called, evidence was presented, closing arguments were made. At the conclusion, a jury of 6 asked to render a verdict. They found that the governor's death was a homicide and Wilbur Sanders was the culprit. If true, it meant that Thomas Marr had lost his life for standing up to people who committed murder in the name of authority. More than a half century after Marr was cast in bronze against the Rocky Mountains, President John F. Kennedy arrived in Ireland to pay homage to the land of his ancestors. One of them, Patrick Kennedy, a laborer, had left New Ross County, Wexford, in the worst year of the famine, the same time that Marr was sentenced to death by hanging in 1848. Like Marr, Patrick would never see his father again, nor his brother and sister. When the great grandson of that exiled Kennedy touched down in 1963, he was greeted as royalty, the last prince of Ireland, like a rainbow coming off a plane, as one historian wrote of his arrival on June 26. Kennedy was the first American president to visit Ireland during his term in office. He was feted at a parade through the streets of Dublin, riding past statues of the rebel William Smith, the O'Brien, and the liberator Daniel O'Connell, showered in shredded bus tickets used for lack of ticker tape. In New Ross, he ate salmon sandwiches with a cousin and joked that he might be working at the local factory had Patrick not left for Boston. It took 115 years to make this trip said Kennedy. He was traveling with a few precious remnants of Thomas Mar's life and was mulling a speech that included a section about the general. He wanted to explain why the words and deeds of an Irishman long dead still mattered. The rebels of 1848 had done well. The prison sentences, the harassment, the banishments by the British Empire had only delayed the careers of a generation of brilliant Irish. Richard O'Gorman, Mar's eulogist, a fugitive, became one of New York's most prominent legal authorities and a Superior Court judge. Another Clongowes Wood School friend, Patrick J. Smith, was elected to the House of Commons on an Irish Home Rule ticket, serving 3 terms for his work on behalf of democratic movements worldwide. He was made a Chevalier of the Legion d'Honneur in France. Kevin O'Doherty, the doctor whose presence was a palliative for Mar's loneliness, sharing grog and laughs on a bridge touching both of their prison districts in Tasmania, moved to Paris and married his lover, Eva the poet. After being pardoned, he was allowed to return to Dublin, where he became a fellow at the Royal College of Surgeons and set up a practice. But degraded Ireland did not suit him. He and Eva moved to Australia, where he pioneered medical societies, set up hospitals and schools. The couple had 8 children. The man who betrayed the young Ireland leaders, John Balfe, spent his remaining years in Tasmania auctioning his principles to the highest bidder. Denounced at a public dinner for not long after Marr had unmasked him, he was jailed in 1852 for attacking one of his accusers. Balfe was arrested again in 1863 for assault. After being elected to the legislature in 1868, Balfe was censored for selling his vote. A more nefarious transaction cannot be instanced in the miserable annals of parliamentary corruption, one newspaper noted. As for the Marrs, the elder Thomas Francis always stood by the son whose temperament could not have been more different from his own. While the boy was in prison, he had paid his legal fees and was a regular visitor. Though he seldom showed it, his affection for his son is extreme. His hometown newspaper reported during the days that Thomas awaited execution. The Marr patriarch lived well into his 80s, dying in 1874. Elizabeth Marr grew close to the son that her late husband never saw. Thomas Bennett Marr, on her suggestion, the boy moved to the United States, living with her for a time in New York. He bore an uncanny resemblance to his father. He enrolled at West Point, but showing another family trait, was kicked out of the military academy for multiple demerits. Libby died in 1906 at the age of 75. Young Thomas wandered, moving west, then to the Philippines, where he died in 1909. His son, Thomas Francis Marr III, lived a quiet life in California, dying in 1943. He is buried in the lovely Napa Valley town of St. Helena. 2 days after landing in Dublin, President Kennedy addressed the Parliament of an independent Irish republic. The centerpiece of his visit, it had taken 2 more rebellions in 1867, led by the Fenians, and the 1916 Easter Rising, led by a linguist with a love of Gaelic, for the little island to finally break free of the 800-year hold of England. Marr's words had been resurrected by leaders of the fight in 1916. His speeches were reprinted, passed around in underground posts, muscled into service before blood was shed when the rebels took over key government buildings. We declare the rights of the people of Ireland to the ownership of Ireland. The proclamation was signed by 7 men. Within days, those men were captured and imprisoned at Killimangold, where Marr had awaited his execution. A picture of him and Smith O'Brien, shadowed by guards, was still in the archives. One by one, on select days in May, the 7 leaders of the Eastern Rising were dragged into a gravel courtyard of the jail and shot to death. The last man to be executed, James Connolly, was unable to stand because of the wounds to his legs. The killings outraged the Irish in America, the Irish in Europe, and the Irish in Australia, and millions of others. The executions were followed by an outright war for independence against the exhausted rulers of the British Empire. This conflict ended in 1922 with the establishment of the Irish Free State, consisting of 26 of the island's 32 counties. 6 in the northeast opted to stay with England. The terms were contentious. Civil war followed, families killing families from the same counties, same villages where they lived. The fratricide ended in 23 when the establishment of the Republic of Ireland in 49. The nation formally severed all ties to the British monarchy and the Commonwealth and bound itself to a constitution that guaranteed freedom of worship. Gaelic was recognized as the national language along with English. Kennedy recalled some of his history, Ireland's misery and Ireland's triumphs. In his speech before the Parliament when he ran for president, many of his own country doubted whether an Irish Catholic could serve a nation of many creeds. In Texas during the campaign, Kennedy minced no words before an audience of Protestant ministers. I believe in an America where the separation of church and state is absolute. He said, a nation where no religious body seeks to impose its will directly or indirectly upon the general populace or the public acts of its officials. It sounded remarkably similar to the speech that Marr, a man of faith, had given in San Francisco, praising the design of a constitution that kept the state out of the affairs of the soul. At the time of his great grandfather fled, the Atlantic was a bowl of bitter tears, Kennedy told his Irish audience. He noted that Benjamin Franklin had sent leaflets to Irish freedom fighters, Daniel O'Connell was inspired by George Washington, and that the emancipator Abraham Lincoln was influenced by the rebel Robert Emmet. Kennedy's longest anecdote was the story of General Marr and his Irish Brigade. He recounted the bloodbath at Fredericksburg, a band of 1,200 men going to battle with a pinch of green in their caps, only 280 surviving. And after telling about the immigrants of the New York 69th, Kennedy displayed a present he had bought from the United States, one of the flags from Marr's Irishmen. What was it, Kennedy asked, that got so many families through centuries of subjugation, through starvation, through mass eviction, through exile, through know-nothing prosecutions? The quality of the Irish, the president concluded, is the remarkable combination of hope, confidence, and imagination. In a short few months, Kennedy would be gone, killed by an assassin in Dallas. He left words on that early summer day in Dublin that the Irish recall today, praise for one of the youngest of nations and the oldest of civilizations. The Civil War flag that the president gave to the people of Ireland joined other mementos of Marr's life in the land of his birth. The lad's clarinet, silenced as an act of schoolboy disobedience, then used to entertain his cellmates awaiting death at the prison in Clonmel, was put on display. Around town, bright banners proclaim in Waterford, birthplace of the Irish tricolour, first raised here by Thomas Francis Marr in 1848. A large equestrian statue, a match for the one in Montana, was erected in 2004, just off the River Suir at the entrance to the city. This Marr is tall in the saddle, next to the 1,100-year-old Viking round tower that still holds a cannonball from Cromwell's rampage. A few doors away, a plaque adorns the house. I leave my memory. In 2015, the new Waterford Bridge over the river, the longest single-span crossing in Ireland, was named for the favorite son of the nation's oldest city across the Atlantic in the same year. The artist Ron Tunnison was commissioned to create a bronze portrait of Marr. The general's visage will be placed next to the grave of his widow in the country that took him in at Brooklyn's Greenwood Cemetery. It is the living, of course, who need these markers of the dead in order to make sense of their place in this world. More than 80 million people with some Irish blood, most of them no longer looking for a country to call home. For them, memory is not an unwelcome burden, but the raw material of stories that will always be passed on in song, verse, or tale, the great survival skill of the Irish. All right. Sorry, I knew I had to finish it up, so I was like, I can't just leave like one or two pages for tomorrow. We should just start a new book tomorrow. But yeah, I mean, a fitting end to be murdered in the wild, wild west by some gas criminals on a boat. I would imagine he was stabbed or shot or something like that. Um, and tossed over. But I mean, they were literally having pictures sent. It's like, this is you, death. And if you don't get the picture, like, we're going to kill you here. Like, so wow, quite a life. And I really like how he wrapped it all full circle to being about Ireland and what he wanted. Um, and that in the spirit of the Irish, or the fight, but also the memory of what they've been through, what they fought for and how they fought, and I think that that still um carries on today. So yeah, I'm glad he has that statue in Montana. I've never heard of him, and I did not know how much that the Irish contributed in the Civil War, but now I do, and I'm glad that I read that new book tomorrow. I love you so much. Sleep well.